Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're going through our book by Nancy Pearcey, Finding Truth. And we just started out, so you haven't missed much. You got 2 episodes to go through. But if you want, all we did was the intro, which is kind of nice because she summed it up, the entire book for us. And
she went through all 5 principles.
Right. We looked at a guide on how to identify different worldviews so that you don't have to kind of know every facet of every single worldview that you might encounter. This kind of gives you general principle outlines on how to identify and attack and answer different objections that you might come across. And so her principles, she has 5 principles that she gets from Romans 1. Mm-hmm. The first one that we're going over in detail today is identifying the idol, because everyone who has not recognized who God is will always create an idol and supplant the image of the divine for the image of man or some other thing. Then part 2 is that we identify the idol's reductionism. How does it reduce man, and how does kind of the stuff that the world shows people that humanity is, how do the different worldviews kind of not fit that into the box and say, well, that's kind of outside. So that'll be an interesting chapter. Yeah. And then the next 2 are internal critiques of the worldview. The first one is testing the idol. Does it contradict what we know about the world? So what do we see in the world, and how does that worldview that you're testing, how does that take into those that effect, and does it have explanation power to it?
Yeah, so the fancy word for this is the worldview empirically adequate? Mm-hmm. Right? Does it meet our experience of the world kind of thing? Yeah.
And then 4 is test the idol. Does it contradict itself? Does it meet its own standard? Mm-hmm. That's definitely an important one. And the final one is, of course, always give them the word. Always give them the salvation message of the gospel. Make the case for Christianity is what she calls it. Replace the idol. That's our goal. Our goal is not to argue for argument's sake. It's not to win points. It's not to have the most likes on social media, although that seems to be a bigger trend now. But that's our goal, is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. So.
Yeah, so it's interesting here. She, as I think we pointed out last time, she wants her book here. Let me see if I can find it real quick, to really deal with these, with this issue. She says, let's see, maybe that's not it. So what she was trying to accomplish here is to give us really a way to deal with every worldview, right? So that we don't have to know every worldview and know every answer to every worldview, but a general take on how to deal with worldviews, right? Is what she's after here. Right. That's what she's trying to do.
And so we're starting part 2, principle 1. So you can kind of think this is chapter 2. She entitles it Twilight of the Gods. And if you ever remembered the old TV show In Search of with Leonard Nimoy, he covered the kind of this book of the aliens coming down and being our gods, what we come to think as the Egyptian gods, the Babylonian gods, really aliens. So this is the Twilight of the Gods. So she's using this as kind of a tongue-in-cheek version of these different small g gods coming and trying to supplant big G God into his rightful place, and they're trying to come in. So we're identifying the idol. So we should name it and claim it, as certain denominations would say. So we want to make sure that we're fully understanding what people are presenting, and so this chapter will help.
Yeah, and so and I think this is interesting, and she kind of makes this point that we get an advantage if we don't just say belief versus unbelief, right? A believer versus an unbeliever. She says no. Well, a better approach would be a believer in God versus a believer in an idol. right? Because all folks have idols, right?
Right.
Even the people that claim not to believe anything, they have idols, right? And so and we'll see that as we go through this, right? So this identifying idols, and which she pulls right out of Romans chapter 1, is I think a helpful concept.
Right. There's no one that's approaching you that is in a neutral point. They should also be offering up a alternative explanation to your explanation. It's enough to answer critiques and attacks, but this guide will help you kind of turn it and say, okay, well, what are you bringing to the table? Because there's obviously some way that the other person that you're talking to is viewing the world. How do they view evidence? What constitutes as evidence for their side? And so this way you kind of, instead of needing to understand quantum physics to figure out whether or not quantum physics is a direct argument for God, you can take a step back and say, okay, well, what about quantum physics allows you to generate that idea and believe that science gives you truthful data, or that it lends to the credibility of whatever they're arguing for. So this helps does that.
It's kind of, the question kind of like, okay, fine. What has to be the case for science, even in general, to work, right? And this is kind of a transcendental question, a presuppositional question, right? So we don't let the unbeliever get away with these assumptions. Oftentimes in evidentialist approaches, the unbeliever just gets away with all kinds of assumptions because we're focusing on a particular evidence. And, we're saying, well, let's step back because there are all kinds of assumptions and we want to know how they deal with those. Right. And so we don't allow them to get away with that stuff. Right?
Yeah. Presuppositionalists aren't opposed to evidence. We just need to understand where somebody is coming from to be able to claim that evidence as good or wrong or
right. And we attempt to try to help them to see where they're coming from.
Right. All right. So she gives a story about a student who has these questions, and he goes to his church and unable to find it until he comes to her and realizes that in college that there are answers to the hard questions of Christianity, and we shouldn't be afraid of those things. We make a serious mistake, is what she says, when Christian parents, teachers, and churches dismiss young people's doubts and questions. And I almost think that we're finally enough away from this type of attitude where this is now becoming more the cases. We're understanding what apologetics is. There's more resources out there. There's more books being written. There's more, the kind of the benefit of living in the so-called post-Christian America or the post-Christian West is the true Christianity has been able to be more readily identifiable, and people are able to say, okay, here's a bunch of people who are attacking our position. Great, now we know who the real people are, or at least better understand, and now are there answers to these questions, like contradictions in the Bible, which we went over a Jason Lyle book, which you can find that in our.
He has over 400 that he deals with, right?
Yeah. So
technically, this guy actually didn't go to her. He went to Francis Schaeffer and Labrie there.
Yeah.
That's where he began to get his answers from.
Right.
Yeah.
So young people are now finding opportunities to find answers to their question, and the good news is that there are answers. Because we are created in God's image as rational, responsible beings, we all have a philosophy. It's also called universal. We all have one, so it's part of our humanitarian makeup. Is again, no one approaches anything in a neutral position. We always try and talk about that position from press to science to court cases, whatever it might be. But the underlying fact is we all come with a certain philosophy to those things. So, if you're coming to a trial for a murder trial and you believe that things can just pop into the universe at random, then the murder weapon might not have a big factor to you being in the husband's car. Then if someone doesn't believe that. So what we bring to the table, we all have one, so it's all universal. So overall, an overall view of life by which we make sense of the world is what we would call this. It's incapable of holding purely arbitrary opinions or making entirely unprincipled decisions. And Bob Murphy, in our discussion about this, talked about this from an economic standpoint, is Ludwig von Mises termed this human action, is we make choices in our daily life about time preferences, what we would like to do, because we have this ability to act, and we don't just take the gold over the lead because nature pushes us to like a rock rolling down a hill. We make specific choices, so there's no arbitrariness in those type of actions. Now, whether those actions are logical, those are another questions. Right. But the very fact is, we all universally have opinions that we don't hold arbitrarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So since young people have questions, she wants us to see how the seriousness of this, and especially if they don't get answered, right? And so she quotes some various, let me just say studies to help bring this point home. So she says in one sociological study, teens were asked why they fell away from the religion in which they were raised, right? And nearly a third, 32%, said that they left the church because of doubts and questions. So that's kind of interesting, right? Why'd you fall away? Because I had doubts and questions. The teen told researchers it didn't make any sense anymore. Some stuff is too far-fetched for me to believe, and I think scientifically, and there is no real proof, and that sort of thing. Another study by David Kinnaman reports that 36% of young adults felt they could not ask life's most pressing questions in church. So not only did they have doubts and questions, they didn't feel like they could pursue them in church, in a religious atmosphere, right? As a result, 23% said that they had significant intellectual doubts about Christian teachings, right? So one would like to think that if you do have these doubts, about Christian teaching and that sort of thing, the church is the place that you would go to try to get those dealt with, right? But according to this, young people didn't feel like they could come to the church and have these questions answered, right?
Boy, I wonder what they would think of the early church. Just, what am I doing here again? All my Jewish family members went over here to this building on Sunday. I have questions on what they believe and why they're not sacrificing in the temple anymore. Can you explain that?
Yeah.
No. Sorry, we're
just
here.
Accept it. That's part of what we do.
We need 3 songs, a 35-minute sermon, no more, and then maybe shake hands and we're out. All right. We got places to be. We got Old Country Buffet to go to.
Yeah, so she suggests, a lot of church youth groups rarely teach apologetics, majoring instead on games and goodies. Oh, so that's kind of I don't know, maybe a low blow, but anyway.
Yeah.
So she says, now parents are rightly concerned about the risks involved in exposing their children to non-biblical perspectives, right? Because there are risks, and so you need to be aware of that. But she says there is also a risk in raising children who think the only way they can test their mettle is by breaking away from their family and their church, right? So they're so caught up into this, well, maybe there's something on the outside that I'm missing, that kind of thing, right? And so competing worldviews often appear more attractive when they acquire the allure of the forbidden. Yeah,
I think this was, too, a response from the whole young, restless, and reform perspective when it came out. It's these ideas of God's sovereignty and depravity and good, theological discussion was almost hidden from us. And so, we were kind of given a watered-down version of the gospel, and everything's only the gospel, and that's it, and you can't ask questions further than that, and not understanding like who God is and how that actually helps build up your understanding of what the gospel is and who it goes to and our role in that. That movement was a kind of an internal response from believers who kind of had the light switch thrown and said, there's more to it than what we've been told, and so this is kind of the opposite of what she's talking about. Is instead of going towards unbelief, these were believers who went deeper into belief because they realized that there was more, and dead guys who had written 1,500 years ago actually talked about this stuff.
Yeah, so she's suggesting here, and the heading of this one is that teens, we leave them vulnerable. Right, when they have questions and issues, and we don't address them. Right, we kind of they don't feel like they can come to the church and get these types of things. She says here the danger is, she gives us an illustration of this, or example. The danger was brought home to me when I talked with a Christian mother who told me, quote, "All the answers we need are in the Bible. We should not have to read anything else." Well, I mean, okay, that's, I don't have a real serious problem with that. But then she said, in the next breath, she confided that her son had recently gone off to college where he promptly joined a new atheist group and rejected his Christian upbringing. Right? So this mother thought she was protecting her son by avoiding discussions of doubts and difficulties. Instead, she left him defenseless. And so when these new ideas came along, he had no context by which to deal with them. Right. And so he was taken in by them. Yeah. Right? So that's her issue here. And so she wants us to understand that we need, as Christians, as the Christian church, we need to be able to equip our young people to deal with these various issues. Now, clearly, that's not the only reason that young people leave the church, right? I think the major reason is probably they weren't saved in the first place.
I think that's a big one, yeah. Yeah. We shouldn't hold people underwater until they drown.
Yeah. But I think it is an important reason, right? And we do need to deal with this, right? Yeah. And so she brings out this particular issue.
Right. I like how she says here that exposing the mind to ideas is like exposing the body to germs. It's a way to build immunity. How many times have you heard, you Christians, you take one part of the Bible seriously, but not the other part. Why are you wearing mixed fibers or eating shellfish or, all that? How many times do we have to deal with those same objections before we just have a quick, pithy response to people? And so when you first hear those things, it's like, oh, why do I do that? There are answers. There are people that have written about it. There are people that have written a myriad of books to help explain it for who the type of person you are. So seek out those answers because they're out there, and we should be ready to have answers ready for people that do have those objections. And hopefully we'll stop hearing those things and we'll hear new things for the next 50 years. All right, so
you will. I don't know if I'll be around.
Well, anyway. Okay. All right. I guess so. Principle 1, identifying the idol. That's where we're beginning. So according to Romans 1, those who reject the Creator will create an idol. Again, Romans 1 says there are no neutral positions. You're either of God or you're not. Either you have the appropriate understanding of the creation order, God and then man and then creation, or you are supplanting one of those in place of God.
Right. Either you accept the truth or you suppress the truth.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
They will absolutize some power or element inanimate within the cosmos, elevating it to an all-defining principle, a false absolute.
Right. So the idea here is that they take from general revelation something in the creation and then make that into God.
Right, and we covered some of those things.
And it becomes their idol. Right, actually.
Yeah. It's not only carved wooden figures. It's also your job or your money or sex,
your philosophy or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're replacing God as a God substitute. So this could be a God of reason, like the enlightened rationalists made. Imagination, like the romanticists. The nation as nationalists do, an economic version of salvation like the Marxists have done. God cannot be rejected without putting something else in his place.
Boy, that is a really good point, right? So it's kinds of, once you reject God, you need something else. It's kind of like, they say nature abhors a vacuum, right?
Right.
And so it's the same kind of way in the spiritual realm, right? The spiritual realm abhors a vacuum. And so if you get rid of God, something else is going to come in. Whether you acknowledge it or realize it or not, something will come in to take God's place.
Right. It's kind of like the argument you hear too that atheism isn't a religion. It's just one less belief in a God that you believe in. Well, okay. I mean, I'll take that as that, but you're still not having the same foundation in how I look at things that I come at things with. So what lens are you looking at the world through? Whatever you've replaced God with, and you can say that, well, I never had God. Okay, what eyeglasses are you looking at the world to make sense of the world? How do you view things as evidence? What do you take for? How do we determine truth? Are there moral absolutes? Why is there something rather than nothing? How did we get here?
What's the ultimate reality? Right? That
yeah.
kind of thing. Right?
And I don't know is a fair assessment, but at some point in one of those questions, you're going to come to a spot where what your actions are can then be delved back into what you actually believe. So you can claim a lot of those things as I don't know. Are there moral absolutes? Well, I don't know. But then, is it okay if I take your wallet without your permission? Well, no. Okay, so there are some things that are.
I thought you didn't know, right?
Yeah, there are some things that are wrong. Now, to what extent those are, we can have that conversation.
Right.
But see how this has helped to identifying, even digging down to see where what they're claiming is not always what their true label is, and they might not even know it. It's not even a critique against them saying I don't know. Maybe they do not know. Yeah. Empiricism. People might not know what that is. So this helps you kind of dig down to then build back up to their kind of first cause, their first look at how they look at the world. God cannot be rejected without putting something else in his place. Most of history is made up of God's surrogates, she says. Every human personality, community, thought form, culture will be based on some ultimate concern or ultimate allegiance, either God or some God substitute, from Timothy Keller. Scripture has given us the key to unlock this history, as we see in Romans 1, but not just in Romans 1. We see in Ezekiel that he calls secular beliefs idols of the heart.
Ezekiel 14:3, she notes there. Yeah.
The Hebrew word for heart isn't kind of the emotional response that we get today. The Hebrew word means the innermost self, including the will, mind, moral character, and spiritual commitment. So it's more than just I have an emotional response. I really have a heartfelt conviction about this. Well, what does that mean? Is that just, well, I feel squishy towards it, or is there more to it? And even the Greek word for heart, cardia, likewise means the center, the core of the person, the being. And I believe when back in the day, the people kind of had the gut reaction. The splanknoid is the Greek word for it, where you kind of feel with your gut how intense you are about something. Thus, idols of the heart are convictions that engage us most deeply and drive our behavior, because those are how we look at the world, and then from there we might not know the specific label for it that philosophers and scientists give it, but it's through those first beliefs that cause us to have action.
Right, and it's virtually impossible to have beliefs without having them affect our behavior. What we believe affects our behavior, right? Regardless of it. And so it's not a neutral issue. It's not an unimportant issue. What people believe ultimately affects their behavior.
Right. Everyone believes something in the sense that they must assume some principle is fundamentally true. Atheists often fail to recognize that they are in the same boat as everybody else. A common mantra is that atheism is not a belief. Atheism is merely a lack of belief in God or gods. But it's impossible to think without some starting point. If you do not start with God, you must start somewhere else. You must prove something else as the ultimate, eternal, uncreated reality that is the cause and source of everything else. Even if you don't view it as ultimate, eternal, uncreated, or reality, there's still something that you're referring to when you talk about the world, or you're not having conversations with people and you believe that you're the only mind in the world. And at least then you're being consistent with that belief.
Right. So the atheist can't say, I mean, they can say, oh, it's just, atheism is just a lack of belief in God, right? No. You must propose, she says, something else as the ultimate, eternal, uncreated reality. You have to do that, right? Again, because something has to take up that vacuum. Right. So we shouldn't allow them to get away with that kind of talking. Right. Yeah.
And so we have these claims that stand up to testing, and so both sides should test what they purport. The advantage of using biblical terms like idols is that it levels the playing field. Secular people often accuse Christians of having quote unquote faith, while claiming themselves base their convictions purely on facts and reasons. Like Spock from Star Trek. Not so. If you press any set of ideas back far enough, eventually you reach an ultimate starting point, something that is taken as self-existent reality on which everything depends. The starting assumption cannot be based on prior reasoning, because if it were, you could ask what was where that reasoning starts, and it often leads to an infinite regress. At some point, every system of thought has to say, this is my starting point. So, if you talk about your ultimates, so what's your ultimate starting point? Well, reason's my ultimate starting point. Okay, well, how are you able to reason? I view whatever this allows me to reason. Okay, well, that's actually your ultimate starting point. So reason isn't really your starting point. Whatever is above that is your ultimate reasoning point. And that's when we get into the so-called problem of circularity, and not all circles are created equal. And so I think we get into that later. So everyone has one, and we all have to find the starting point of our beliefs.
Yeah, good.
Although you cannot argue backwards to their prior reason, you can argue forward by spelling out, one, their implications, and two, testing both the logic that they derive from this and the experience.
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting, right? She says, although we cannot argue backwards to their prior reasoning, we can spell out the implications of what does this imply, and what is the consequences of reasoning like this, right? That's what she's trying to get at here. And so we can test those implications by the test that she's going to eventually give us, right? Experience and reason, logic. Right?
Yeah. And if you're using the Jason Lyle's "don't answer," this part would be the answer part.
Yeah.
Take the worldview and say, okay, let's assume this is true. These are the implications, kind of a reductio ad absurdum type deal.
Right. So oftentimes, it would seem like we're saying, well, if everybody sees through their own lenses, then truth or whatever is just relative, right? But that's not really what we're saying. What we're saying is, yes, people do see through their own lens, but there is a right way to see things. So it's not relative. Their truth does exist, right? And so you have to then find that, right? So it's not everybody sees through their own lens, and therefore, we just are looking through the Christian lens. No, there is a right way to view the world. And so just lensing isn't the final answer.
Right.
The answer is, let's get at there is a true right lens that we need to find and get to.
Yeah, the three blind men touching the elephant. Each one views it as something completely different. What the point of the story is that none of the men are correct. Right. and that the elephant is more than the sum of the parts that they're feeling.
Yeah. So there is really an elephant that's different than what each one of them thinks, right? Yeah. And so the person telling the story apparently is either not blind, or it can avoid the problems that being blind has.
Yeah.
Because they can see the whole elephant.
Maybe reveal it in written and spoken word.
Or at least they assume that their perspective is the whole elephant, right?
Yeah. Elephant-like.
Yeah. So the next section here is entitled Religion Without God. She says another advantage of using the term idol is that it avoids a kind of dry intellectualism, as though people, choose a life philosophy the way they solve a logical puzzle. She says when people commit themselves to a certain vision of reality, it becomes their ultimate explainer. Right? So their vision of reality, their view of reality, helps them to explain things. Explain what? Well, she says it serves to interpret the universe for them, to guide their moral decisions, right? To give meaning and purpose to life and all the other functions normally associated with religion. So notice, again, our beliefs kind of affect our behavior in these various ways, right? So in this section, she asked the question, is there one feature shared by all religions? Now, she's going to say yes, but she's going to suggest that it's not necessarily the feature that we think it is, right? And so she's going to go through various of these. And so the first one here you can deal with regard to morality.
Yeah. So if a personal deity is not required, which we kind of think when we talk about religion is, everyone always talks about a god when it comes to religion. Well, in many Eastern religions, they are kind of amoral. They teach that everything must be accepted as parts of the one or the whole, the yin, the yang, both good and evil. The goal is the balance or union of opposites. So
that's kind of interesting. Because everything is one, there is no good and evil because it's all the same.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. That's there must be balance to the force, and you can never get rid of the Sith or the dark side. There just must be balance, and that's the goal.
The question is, how do you know that's the dark side if everything is one, right? There's no way to determine dark side from light side other than the side that I like, maybe, right?
And before Disney destroyed everything, there were some really good books out there. Because, as we know, only Sith deal in absolutes, and that's what we're going for here. So I don't know what that says about us. And then there's pantheism. Pantheism teaches that it's a mistake to draw any moral distinctions whatsoever. Everything merges into one. The end result, however, is that you can't distinguish good from evil, which means you have no basis for fighting against evil.
You're right.
And
again, if everything is one, then everything is one. There is no good or evil. Right. Yeah.
So there are things like the movie Avatar that promotes this kind of Gaia-like hypothesis. Significantly, the Gaia is portrayed as beyond good and evil. One of the natives says, "Our great mother does not take sides; she protects only the balance of life," which then makes no sense because the whole second half or the third half of the movie is about fighting against the imperial, not Americans but Earthlings, to then stop this war from happening. But isn't the war in the whole plan of Gaia? Why are we stopping it? Doesn't this bring balance in some way of curtailing the species or?
And there's a logical problem there. It's kind of subtle and sneaky, but the idea here is that what is this? Iwa is portrayed as beyond good and evil. And one of the natives says that our great mother does not take sides. Wait a minute. What does she do? She protects only the balance of life. Isn't that a side?
Yeah.
I think that's a side, right? So the balance of life, the balance of life then is the good that she's protecting. So she's not beyond good and evil. There is a good there. So the other side must be, I don't know what that side is, but clearly she's taken a side.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. And somehow we can destroy her in the movie. But but James Cameron should not be the be-all, end-all for good movies. Polytheistic religions may demand rituals to appease the gods and guarantee good health and good harvest, but often they say nothing about morality. Anthropologist Mary Douglas discovered in her research that there is no inherent relationship between religion and morality. There are primitives who can be religious without being moral and moral without being religious. So indeed, pagan gods are often outright immoral, and we see this if you studied any Greek mythology, Roman mythology. Usually the gods are doing bad things, and humanity is reacting to that, including Zeus turned himself into a cow, and all the fun stuff of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The gods are not really ever portrayed as good. In fact, when they do good, like Prometheus. He does good for humanity. He's punished for all eternity. So there's no sense of real like objective goodness, and the gods aren't there to be looked up upon. They're just elements from the nature of where the Romans and the Greeks came from. So, where they saw amorous things or amoral things, they had gods in place to say, kind of, this is why they are.
Right. So they were used as an explanatory device.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So no one said Zeus was, the champion of the pantheon of the gods because he was the most, kind. He just happened to be the most powerful. And if you look at Greek and Roman civilization, I mean, that spoke a lot more than being an objective moral creature. So, do all theologies at least involve some kind of worship ritual? No. Again, in ancient Greece, Epicurean taught that the gods exist but take no interest in human affairs, and the blind watchmaker. Other religions that practice no worship include Brahmin Hinduism and Theravada Buddhism. So a lot of the kind of staples that we think of when you hear the word religion so far don't meet her expectation, our expectations.
Right. So then, are there any features that are shared by all religions? And surprisingly, she says only one. She says the only feature shared by all religions is that they acknowledge something as divine, using that word, divine, to mean the self-existence, eternal reality that is the origin of everything else, right? So the ultimate reality, the thing that, is the origin, brings everything else into existence. That then becomes the common denominator, she suggests, with regard to religion. That's what they share, and she calls this, deity, right, or not something as divine. Yeah, is what she calls it.
And if you watch something like the old or even the new Cosmos or Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot speech, the majesty that he talks about the universe fits this definition to the T. He views the creation of the universe, the actual universe itself, as this kind of divine being that brings forth life, and that when we look into it, we look into ourselves, and we should say thank you and worship the sun in the sense that the sun gives us life, and so our ancestors who worshipped the sun, small S-U-N, they weren't too far off the beaten path. They're just deified it where he wouldn't deify.
Yeah. So, so with regard to this, then, self-existence, eternal reality that they all share, she says, as a result, religions are a lot more like philosophies than most people think.
Right.
And philosophies are a lot more like religions, right? Structurally, both start with a set of postulates about what is ultimately real or divine. Right, and then they go from there. She says, think of the divine as whatever is furthest back, beyond, or behind everything else. For example, in polytheism, the personal gods and goddesses are not the ultimate reality because they derive from some pre-existing primordial substance, and that is what actually functions as a divine. So that is what she suggests is the commonality between all religions. And as she mentions here, it's a lot like philosophy.
All right.
Right? Yeah. So, for some folks, nature itself is divine. This is the idol of paganism. Nature becomes the divine. It is the ultimate and that sort of thing. And so that is what she says is the common idea here.
Right. Well, I think here's where we're going to stop. This is kind of chapter 2, so the next one will be the second part of chapter 2, and we'll try and get through the rest of it. But this is a good place to stop because the second part deals with these types of philosophies and what their beliefs are, and again, identifying what their idols are. So, when it comes to things that philosophers or scientists believe that are replacing the idea of the biblical Christian God, we're identifying how they're lifting up that idea, that belief system, or if it's
that
if
view
it's
of the
different
ultimate reality or whatever.
then we should first identify it. So that's what this part one of the 5-part plan that Nancy Pearcey has for us. That's what we're going to do.
And so she's going to give us next some examples of how to do that so that we can at least get a feel for what that looks like.
Right.
And we'll do that next time.
Yeah.
Right?
So thank you.
All right.